Chapter 1. Wickham. George Wickham used his turn as dealer as an opportunity to study the three men seated with him. The late hour rendered the Meryton Inn's common room empty of all but his table and the weary innkeeper. A haze of smoke, the product of cheap candles, firewood, and cheroot, hung about the room. Wickham's companions watched his hands through blurry, bloodshot eyes, fixated, looking for any indication he was cheating. They could look all they liked. They'd find no wrongdoing on his part. For once he didn't even need to consider cheating. He was winning, more than he ever had before. Enough that he could pay off all his IOUs or all his debts in Meryton. Better still, he'd played with different men all evening. With him winning so much, no one had remained long. It would be days, if ever, that anyone gathered enough gossip to have an idea how well he'd done tonight. Only one hand remained, one more fleecing of these last few desperate fellows. Then he'd go. He'd already told them as much. This sort needed that warning. They either wouldn't or couldn't walk away from a game of cards. Sorry sods. Wickham had learned long since that the best way to handle men like them was a drawn-out, oft-mentioned departure. He dealt the cards, picked his up, and flashed an evil grin, quickly suppressed. In truth, he had nothing. His luck had finally run out. They didn't need to know that, though. "I fold," the one to his right said, and slapped his cards down on the table. Wickham looked to see the man across from him studying his face. The one to his left seemed too drunk to know if his hand would play or not. Wickham slid a few coins into the middle of the table. The man across from him cursed. He slapped his cards down and pushed back his chair, pent-up anger sending the rickety bit of furniture skidding away. "I've had enough," he declared, and stomped away. Wickham shrugged. He turned back to the man on his left. "Are you in?" "What?" The mumbled question was accompanied by rapid blinking. "Are you playing that hand?" Wickham pressed. "He's not," the fellow to Wickham's right said. "Come on, Walt. Let's get you home so your wife can have at you." He offered Wickham a nod. "No hard feelings. We'll win it back tomorrow." Wickham grinned, nodded, and gathered up the cards. He waited for the other three to be well gone before standing from the table. Feeling generous, he tossed the half-asleep innkeeper a coin as he headed out into the night. Or, if he was any judge, the early morning. Projecting easy confidence in case anyone watched him with avaricious ideas, Wickham sauntered back to his room. Once there, he locked the door and wedged the cramped space's lone chair against the thin wood. He set about removing the notes he'd won from various places about his person, making a pile on the bed. Then he sat down to gleefully count. Once satisfied he had an accurate total, Wickham pulled off his boots. They were special, his boots. For one, he'd commissioned them with a down payment from the funds old Mr. Darcy had left him. For another, he'd stiffed the Derbyshire cobbler. Sure, Mr. Darcy the younger, Wickham's one-time friend, would pay the debt. Knowing the stuffy, upright, holier-than-thou Mr. Darcy had paid for boots specially made with secret pockets to hold oftentimes ill-gotten gains, filled Wickham with glee. He stuffed all but £7 of his cash into the boots. They barely had enough room to hold it all and still fit back on his feet. He flexed his toes, enjoying the feel of so much money along his calves and ankles. Yes, it was more than enough to pay either his debts in town or his IOUs to his fellow militiamen. Either way, he'd even have a little left over. He wiggled his toes and tried to choose which debts to satisfy. Logically, he should pay his IOUs. The regiment would soon be headed to Brighton. If he stiffed the merchants of Meryton, he'd never be welcome there again, but why would he ever want to return to such a countrified backwater? Better to have the men of his regiment think him honest, and willing to gamble with him more. An evil smile crept across his face. Why part with any of his winnings? He'd earned them, after all. He'd played fiendishly well all evening, for hours, while lesser men threw themselves against his skill and broke like waves. Waves of winning. Wickham gave his head a little shake, reflecting he could have done with a touch less to drink. Still, the idea was sound. He shouldn't give up any of his hard-earned coin. Instead, he would leave. Part with all his debts and keep all his money. With quick, sure movements, he went about the little room and gathered his possessions, stuffing them into a carpet bag which overflowed. He put the few things that didn't fit into a sack. Then he moved the chair, unlocked the door, grabbed the bag and sack, and crept from the room. In moments, he was back out on the street, no one the wiser. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the sky was a bit lighter in the east. A glance down the street showed the stirrings of morning. A shabbily dressed man with a ladder was putting out the few guttering streetlights the town boasted. A supply wagon had pulled up alongside the inn. Neither of those were of use to Wickham. He walked a bit farther, pace quick, toward the edge of town. He'd keep walking if he had to, but he'd prefer a faster, less strenuous option. 2 streets down he found a somewhat squat man, with rough-cut hair and nondescript workman's garb, loading a wagon. The man wasn't tall, but looked strong. They'd be even in a fight, if no one cheated. Wickham plastered an amiable expression on his face and sauntered over. "Where are you headed?" The man shot him a quick, assessing look. "Southeast." "Mind if I join you?" Wickham asked. "If you let me ride with you, I'll buy you a bit of food on the way." The man shrugged. "Put your stuff in the wagon," he said, and went back to hoisting sacks. Wickham threw his luggage in the back of the wagon, then went around to climb up. While he carried all his money on his person, he didn't like the idea of his possessions in a wagon he wasn't on board. Besides, if the fellow wanted help loading, all he need do was ask. Wickham would be happy to negotiate the service. Apparently the man didn't want help loading. He was slow enough about tossing in the small pile of sacks that Wickham started to sweat. He didn't want anyone to wake early and see him about to depart. Finally, the fellow loaded the last sack and came around to climb onto the hard bench beside Wickham. "Name's Smith. Yours?" Wickham saw no reason to lie, especially since, if the man had been around town at all, he might already know. "Wickham." "Where are you going to?" Smith flicked the reins and set the team moving. Truth very often bred trust. Wickham gave an exaggerated wince and offered a dollop of honesty. "It's more a matter of going from. I'm in the militia, and many of my fellow officers hold my IOUs." Smith looked at him askance. "I can't put you in a debtor prison for that." "No, but they can make my life miserable." Wickham let out a long-suffering sigh. "I won enough last night to pay a few of them off, but not all of them. And everyone will want to be paid. It occurred to me, well, it's easier to leave." An avaricious glint that Wickham recognized well sparked in Smith's eyes. "How much did you win?" £6 and a couple of shillings. Wickham made sure to sound proud, like he was boasting. In truth, he'd won much more. He'd put £6 and change in his wallet, though. Smith's interest dimmed. "Don't forget you offered to pay for lunch." "Yes, but I didn't say you could have whatever you like," Wickham countered. They reached the edge of town and headed southeast. The horizon glowed like an open flame, but the golden orb of the sun still lurked below, out of sight. Smith's team, well past their prime, plodded forward at a slow pace. They took turns driving and stopped often to rest the team. Wickham wasn't really worried about being followed. No one would realize he'd left for quite some time. Still, each delay made him nervous. He didn't see why the quarter-full wagon, the sacks turning out to be cabbages, necessitated such slow going. The sun still lingered just low enough to be in Wickham's eyes when Smith, who was driving, turned them down a farm lane. Wickham's worries returned. Could this be as far as the man meant to go? Wickham would have trouble flagging down a new ride, and they were still uncomfortably near Meryton. "You farm?" Wickham asked, endeavouring for a casual note. "Just a little more cargo." Wickham relaxed in relief. He even helped Smith and the dour old farmer load the small collection of sacks, leeks this time, into the wagon. They climbed back in and resumed their course. The next time they rested the team, Smith didn't request a change of driver. Wickham didn't mind. Driving was more work than riding, after all. When they set out again, Smith went only a short way before turning down a narrow trail, hardly wide enough for the wagon. New concerns sprang to life in Wickham's gut. They were going east now, toward the sea, which glittered on the horizon before them. The trail was steep, much more so than a man would risk for any honest purpose. Did Smith mean to accost Wickham for his possessions and £7, then toss his body in the water? The trail sliced through a hill, the wagon occasionally grating on the steep walls. Wickham looked about for a possible weapon, a large rock or a branch, anything. They came out onto a rocky cove. Smith drew the wagon to a halt. A ship was anchored in the narrow bay. It had the look of a wealthy man's private vessel, built more for speed and comfort than for cargo. A small boat was beached beside stacked casks, presided over by two somewhat rough-looking men. At the sight of Smith and his wagon, the two men each hoisted a cask and headed up the beach. Smith jumped out and started removing his meagre stacks of vegetables. Smugglers, Wickham realized. From the look of the casks, he guessed brandy, French contraband. "Give me a hand," Smith called. Wickham craned his neck to look over his shoulder. Somehow his bag was now on the ground, pinned under one of the vegetable piles. He glanced back at the two approaching men. Neither they nor Smith seemed to be armed. He could leave his possessions and run. But why? Smuggling brandy wasn't a real crime, not like robbery, kidnapping, or murder. Most magistrates drank the stuff, after all. Wickham climbed down and went to help Smith remove the rest of the sacks. Once the wagon bed was empty, Smith pulled up the bottom to reveal a secret compartment, deep enough for the casks. The two men reached them, both eyeing Wickham. "Who's he?" one asked, while the other deposited his cask. "He's all right," Smith said. While that didn't answer the question, it appeared to be enough for the man. He nodded and stowed his cask as well. Both men trudged back down the beach toward the stack of casks. "Come on," Smith said, and headed toward the sea. Wickham shrugged and followed. When he reached the pile, he hefted a cask to his shoulder. He tried not to reveal the effort it cost him. Smith lifted his with ease, just like the other two. Wickham reflected that maybe they wouldn't be evenly matched in a fight after all. Certainly, he couldn't take all three. He imagined he was faster than any of them, though, light and lean. Hopefully, he wouldn't need to find out. When all the brandy was loaded and the vegetables and Wickham's possessions back in the wagon, the four of them met halfway up the rocky beach. The two men eyed Wickham again, as if assessing his continued value now that the wagon was loaded. He offered an ingratiating smile. "Jeb find any new buyers?" one of the men asked, turning to Smith. "Not yet." Smith's tone held annoyance. "Says the parson he works for isn't called on by anyone but some old lady and a spinster daughter, and they're too sanctimonious to buy smuggled goods." "But you got someone in London for this load, right?" the other man asked.
Aye, all lined up. Smith nodded. London's getting full up, is all. Competition's driving down the price. Ain't hardly worth the trouble. Well, tell Jeb to make himself useful, the first man muttered. We need a new buyer. I ain't risking my hide for pennies.
He turned and marched back toward the small boat they'd beached. Wickham wagered the little vessel, a rowboat of some sort, only held 2 men, or 1 man and brandy. Out in the bay, the larger vessel bobbed in time with the waves. He hadn't noted anyone on it as they loaded the casks, but that didn't mean it was empty. The remaining man nodded to Smith.
See you?
He broke off, with a glance at Wickham.
Next time.
He settled. He followed the first man to the boat, which they pushed out to sea. Smith turned to Wickham, arms folded across his chest.
I'm off to London now. My brother usually goes with me, but he's otherwise employed. I could use an extra set of hands. Keeps anyone with unlawful intentions at bay.
Wickham watched as the other 2 men got through the crashing waves, one rowing vigorously. So I'd be an asset, Wickham suggested, foregoing mention of the irony of Smith's wish to avoid the unlawful. Smith's gaze shifted toward the other 2 as well, likely with the same thought as Wickham. They were back to 1-on-1. It would take the other 2 men a bit of time and effort to return to the shore. He turned back to Wickham with a grudging shrug.
I'll pay you a shilling a day and feed you.
Day's nearly over, Wickham noted. He didn't fancy a long ride in the dark, just so Smith could get the most out of his first day.
I know some place a couple miles from here.
Meals and drink. Wickham wasn't going to sit on a trove of brandy and go thirsty. Smith gave a curt nod. He turned and headed for the wagon. Wickham figured that meant negotiations were over, so he followed. Your brother, Jeb, I assume, left because the money isn't good? He asked as they climbed aboard. Smith flicked the reins and set about turning the team.
Got himself a woman, and she got a job at the parsonage, so Jeb got a place there too,
Smith said, his focus on his driving.
He's supposed to use his position to find us some rich folk what wants stolen brandy. Thought he might find something worth stealing too, but I don't think he has. Maybe up at the fancy lady's house. Old Bat would probably never notice. What's an old lady and a spinster need with such a big house, I say? They probably don't go in but 10 rooms, if that.
He set them back up the narrow trail, the team noticeably straining. Wickham leaned back and watched the team work. His day was getting better by the moment. Not only had he gotten a free ride this far, he'd be paid to go the rest of the way. Even the destination was fortuitous. He wouldn't mind going to London at all. He could check in on some friends and deposit most of his winnings. Despite his specially made boots, he didn't care for keeping so much of his money on his person. The old team plodded up the hill, making it look like enough work that Wickham was happy he didn't have to walk the steep trail. His day was definitely looking up. In fact, his whole week was, maybe even his year. Yes, from here on out, things were going to go well for him. He could feel it. Chapter 2. Darcy. Large as his aunt's favourite parlour was, Darcy still found the room stuffy. Yet his wish to leave had nothing to do with the thick air. He wanted to walk, with a particular destination in mind, and to do so unaccompanied. Seated on one end of a long sofa, window to his back, he scanned his companions over the top edge of a 2-day-old newspaper. He bided his time until the others seemed well occupied. Darcy's cousin Anne and her companion, Mrs. Jenkinson, sat before a second window, sewing. As far as Darcy recalled, they worked on garments for a new babe, born into one of the families beholden to Rosings, as his Aunt Catherine's estate was known. Anne's gaze was turned toward her work, but her eyes were glazed over. Darcy knew she'd sown such charitable offerings many times before. Aunt Catherine, known as Lady Catherine de Bourgh to most, engaged in quiet conversation with her new favourite toady, the rector of the local parsonage, Mr. Collins. His presence was one of the reasons Darcy wished to take a stroll. Darcy's goal was Mr. Collins' dwelling, and he'd prefer the tall, paunchy man's absence. The room's only other occupant, Colonel Richard Fitzwilliam, cousin to both Darcy and Anne, was Darcy's chief obstacle to an unaccompanied walk. Richard occupied the opposite end of the same sofa on which Darcy sat, likely for the same reason. Light streamed in through the window behind them to make reading easier than in other parts of the gloomy parlour. Richard, too, held a paper before him. He seemed to be doing a much better job of reading than Darcy. Darcy rattled his paper and returned to his perusal of the words. The happenings in the House of Commons lacked their usual import, however. The deeds of parliamentary members couldn't pull his mind from endless contemplation of Miss Elizabeth Bennet and her comments of the evening before. He'd put on an unconcerned face when, while seated at the pianoforte, she'd essentially told him the fault was his if he wasn't competent at socializing with strangers. Her words had stung. They'd sparked annoyance as well. Foremost, for the criticism inherent in them. Second, because they were spoken before his cousin Richard, as if Richard needed more fuel for teasing. Third, because of the easy way Elizabeth and Richard conversed, and the jealousy that camaraderie ignited. Lastly, her words pricked Darcy because her criticism was true. If he practiced socializing more, he would undoubtedly excel at the activity. The aggravating, enchanting Elizabeth Bennet was precisely the person he wished to practice socializing with, but Richard would spoil that. He and Elizabeth couldn't be together without striking up easy conversation. Darcy would be in a terrible fix if Richard were a touch more vehement in his affection for Miss Bennet. Then the choice of taking her for himself, or gifting Richard enough so he could afford to take her, would be upon Darcy. Fortunately, though clearly enchanted, Richard didn't appear enamoured. Richard angled his paper more fully into the light and leaned toward the page, a sure sign he was thoroughly engrossed in an article. Darcy quietly folded his. No one seemed to notice. As casually as he could, he said, "I think I'll stretch my legs," and stood. Richard didn't look up. Lady Catherine's voice droned on. Mr. Collins maintained every appearance of sponging up her words. Anne's eyes stayed glazed over, her hand rising and dipping with each stitch. Mrs. Jenkinson glanced his way, but she wouldn't speak. Darcy started across the room. "Darcy, where are you going?" Lady Catherine asked, tone officious. He kept walking. "To stretch my legs." "Anne, go with Darcy," Lady Catherine ordered. "I'm sewing, Mother," Anne protested. "So put your sewing down and walk with Darcy," Lady Catherine said. "You're to marry him, you must spend time with him." Darcy, nearly to the parlour door, halted. With a grimace he pivoted back, turning in time to see the annoyance on Anne's face. Richard still scrutinized the paper, as well he should. He'd heard their cousin and aunt argue over Anne's marrying Darcy well-nigh 200 times. "I am not going to marry Darcy, Mother. We've been over this," Anne snapped. "And I am not going to marry Anne," Darcy added quietly. "That doesn't mean you can't walk together," Lady Catherine declared. She shot Mr. Collins a prompting look.
"Quite right. Walking together is only proper and good for the health," Mr. Collins offered. "And you two will come to realize you must marry," Lady Catherine stated. Anne levelled a flat stare at her mother. "No, just because you and Darcy's mother thought it would be nice for us to wed, doesn't mean we feel the same." "Of course you do." Lady Catherine swivelled her formidable, jowly visage toward Darcy. "Right, Darcy?" Richard's paper rattled as he folded it closed. "I say, Darcy, I'll walk with you. I could use a bit of fresh air." Darcy shook his head, irritated on all counts. He addressed his aunt. "I will not marry Anne, and I will take a walk," he stated, and all but stomped from the room. He heard Richard stand as he left. The sound of a folded paper plopping down on a tabletop followed Darcy down the hall. By the time he'd gone for his outerwear, Richard awaited him in the foyer, similarly attired. "Shall we?" Richard asked with a gesture toward the door. The beauty of being known for his lack of social grace was that Darcy could simply nod, his annoyance hidden by his generally laconic nature. Once through the door, Darcy jogged down the step. He set a brisk pace toward the parsonage. Richard might be with him, but Darcy could still see Elizabeth at least. Even if she would spend the call chatting with Richard and leave Darcy to engage in stilted conversation with Mrs. Collins and Miss Maria Lucas, Mrs. Collins' younger sister. Once they were well on their way, Richard cleared his throat. Darcy shot him a quick glance, realizing his cousin had something on his mind. He slowed his pace, interest piqued despite himself. "I was thinking, since we've extended our stay here," Richard began. He cast Darcy a quick, assessing look. "Well, should we invite Georgiana to join us?" Darcy frowned, surprised by the suggestion. "She doesn't care to visit Rosings." His shy, meek little sister, only 15, was generally bowled over by their aunt. Richard cleared his throat again. "Yes, I realize she finds Aunt Catherine daunting. It's simply, after the incident in Ramsgate, I can't help but worry each time she's left too long on her own." Understanding unfurled in Darcy. Georgiana wouldn't make such an error again, he asserted. In truth, she hadn't followed through with her ill-conceived plan the first time. She hadn't run off with George Wickham. She'd told Darcy of the plan instead, and he'd put everything right. Chased off Wickham, fired Georgiana's old governess, and hired a new one. Though nearly disastrous, his little sister's near elopement with Wickham was now safely behind her. Richard stopped walking. "Are you certain? She seemed rather, well, resentful to me, as if she wished she hadn't confessed to you." Darcy stopped as well, and turned to his cousin in surprise. He hadn't realized Richard and Georgiana had spoken on the issue. He'd informed Richard, of course. As Georgiana's co-guardian, Richard deserved to know about her near elopement. "I'm sure she's happy she confessed." Richard shrugged. "I think she's still enamored of Wickham and regrets she didn't go with him. And you never know where that villain will turn up. Mark my words, Darcy, he's not out of your life yet. No, Wickham and I are through. I paid him for the living my father left him at his insistence. I paid his debts in Derbyshire. Under very firm orders, he's not to be given any credit there ever again. I sent him fleeing Ramsgate after he attempted to elope with Georgiana. He wouldn't dare trouble us again." Darcy shook his head. He was forced to join the militia to make ends meet. They'll keep him out of trouble. With his regiment stationed in the countryside, Georgiana is perfectly safe in London. "I guess I want to assuage my guilt over how vastly we almost failed her," Richard finally said. Darcy nodded and resumed walking.
I understand the urge, but forcing Georgiana to endure Lady Catherine seems too harsh a punishment, even for the crime of almost running off with George Wickham. It wasn't his sister's fault she was charmed by the man. Everyone else had been, from Darcy's father to local merchants to the Bennet sisters. I just can't shake the feeling Wickham will come back to haunt you again, Richard said, matching Darcy's stride. The militia is going to Brighton in a few weeks. I'll take Georgiana to Pemberley. I doubt Wickham has the money to travel that far. He won't bother us again. They fell into companionable silence, Richard's gaze abstract, but as they neared the Hunsford parsonage, his eyes refocused. He glanced about, then darted a look at Darcy. The Collins? Mr. Collins, as you know, is not at home. What better time to visit? Darcy said dryly. His comment earned a wry smile from Richard. They presented themselves at the door. A maid answered and showed them in. They found Mrs. Collins, Elizabeth, and Miss Lucas in the parsonage's small parlour. All three women stood to greet them. Miss Lucas held a ball of yarn, Elizabeth a skein of it. "Mr. Darcy, Colonel Fitzwilliam," Mrs. Collins greeted with a smile and a curtsy. Elizabeth and Miss Lucas also bobbed their greetings. Despite her full hands, Elizabeth managed the act with grace. Miss Lucas fumbled her curtsy, her expression a bit awed. "Mrs. Collins, Miss Bennet, Miss Lucas," Richard greeted, after a pause. Darcy frowned, realizing Richard had given him a heartbeat to reply, then taken the nicety upon himself. For someone practicing his social graces, Darcy wasn't off to a good start. "Mr. Collins is out," Mrs. Collins said. "He's calling on your aunt, I believe." Richard cast Darcy a quick look, then turned back to Mrs. Collins. "Yes, he is. We came out to stretch our legs, and wouldn't you know, they brought us to your doorstep." Intelligent blue eyes, set in a slightly less attractive than average visage, scanned over Darcy and his cousin. "I see," Mrs. Collins said. "Would you care for tea?" "We would be most obliged," Richard said. "I dare say we'll now miss tea at Rosings." "Then do come sit down," Mrs. Collins offered. Soon they were all seated about a low table. Mrs. Collins, Darcy noted, was a very adept hostess. Her manners were exemplary, each movement precise and easy-seeming. She served them in the proper order, asked all the correct questions, and cheerfully prompted conversation. She was wasted on Mr. Collins. Once they were all served, and the topic of weather exhausted, Elizabeth turned her beguiling eyes toward Darcy. He immediately put down his teacup. He also tamped down his pleasure that she should turn to him, and not Richard. "So, Mr. Darcy," her eyes glinted with amusement, "do I dare construe this visit as your attempt to practice social niceties? Are you in fact accepting my advice, however cruelly given?" "You may, and I am," he replied. "Why, this is terrible, then," she proclaimed in bright, mocking tones. "Terrible?" Richard asked before Darcy could speak. "That Darcy should practice, or that he's taken your advice?" Elizabeth turned her attention on Richard. To Darcy's chagrin, "Why, that he should practice," she declared. "Now I must abide by my own advice and practice as well. Only," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "I am too proud. I cannot consign myself to the back-room pianoforte, on which your aunt offered to let me practice." "Then humble yourself," Mrs. Collins advised. "Miss de Bourgh's companion is a wonderful woman. You should be honoured to have the use of the pianoforte in her room." Elizabeth's impertinent smile transformed into a wry grimace. "I stand reprimanded by my oldest friend." "I would be happy to practice on any pianoforte," Miss Lucas said staunchly. But you were not the one invited, Elizabeth quipped, although Lady Catherine would be happier to have you invade Mrs. Jenkinson's room than me, since you would be more grateful. Mrs. Collins offered her a repressive, if amused look. She turned to Mr. Darcy. "Did you find the walk over pleasant, Mr. Darcy?"
"Yes,"
he said, then fell to wondering what he might say next. He refused to look to Richard. His cousin was certain to have a topic, but Darcy was determined to speak. "You must make the walk often," he finally added. "We do, although your aunt orders the carriage for our return. She is the soul of generosity with her carriage, company, and advice." "Especially her advice," Elizabeth murmured. "And the carriage is for leaving Rosings, but not for coming to Rosings. I'm not certain what message that conveys." Miss Lucas giggled. "This parsonage is also a splendid stop while on a ride," Richard stated. "If you deem it so, then you must by all means view it as such." Mrs. Collins accompanied her words with a smile that made them seem genuine. "We should be delighted to have you two gentlemen visit as often as you like." "The pleasure will be ours," Richard replied, grin charming. Darcy wished Richard wouldn't turn that grin on Elizabeth, but he did. Darcy was possessed with the odd urge to scowl at his cousin. He repressed the desire, but couldn't make it recede as tea went on. Richard continued to banter lightly with all three women, even drawing Miss Lucas into a smattering of conversation. Darcy didn't manage to get in 4 more words. Not that he knew what words he would say. He could have thought of some, though, if Richard weren't always speaking. They rose to leave after a long half-hour. Darcy could feel Elizabeth's eyes on him as he bowed to the room, but could think of nothing to say other than farewell. No witty words, not even an appropriate expression. A smile would be too forward, a frown was uncalled for. He settled for calm reserve, an image he endeavoured to maintain as he and Richard set off toward Rosings, his cousin chatting amiably about their visit and Elizabeth's loveliness the whole way.